doctor mocked the simple gardener. Then he asked a question that froze the doctor. Dr. Robert Miller paused his walk through the halls of Mercy General Hospital when he heard his colleagues' laughter echoing from the main entrance. Once again, he was about to turn the break into an opportunity to wield his sharp tongue against the employee he despised the most. Frank Johnson was adjusting the anthurium seedlings in the pot near the reception desk when he felt the familiar gaze burning into his back. After 15 years working at that hospital, he knew the signs that preceded another episode of public humiliation. "Well, look what we have here," Robert announced loudly enough for everyone in the reception area to hear. "Our favorite gardener playing with his little plants. Must be comforting to have such a simple job, isn't it, Frank?" The other doctors chuckled softly, some feeling uncomfortable, but none daring to confront Dr. Miller. Robert was known for his surgical skill, but also for his venomous tongue and oversized ego. Frank continued his work in silence, his calloused hands gently handling the plants he loved so much. His broad shoulders hunched slightly, but he didn't turn to face the doctor. "You know, Frank," Robert continued, stepping closer with a cruel smile on his lips, "sometimes I wonder what it must be like to live such a limited life, playing in the dirt all day, no real responsibilities, no saving lives like we do here." This time, something different happened. Frank paused his movements and slowly straightened up, turning to face the doctor. His dark eyes, usually calm, burned with an intensity Robert had never seen before. "Dr. Robert," Frank said, his voice quiet but firm. "May I ask you a question?" Robert raised an eyebrow, amused by the audacity. "Of course, Frank. I'm always willing to educate the less enlightened." Frank took a step forward, and something in his posture made Robert's smile falter slightly. "Why have you never visited your mother's grave at the cemetery where I work on Sundays?" The silence that followed was deafening. Robert felt the blood drain from his face, his legs trembled, and he had to subtly lean against the wall behind him. The other doctors exchanged confused glances, but immediately sensed something had shifted in the air. I don't know what you're talking about," Robert muttered, his voice losing all its former authority. "Mrs. Margaret Miller," Frank continued, relentless. "Grave number 347, Section B. For 15 years, I've tended to her grave every Sunday. 15 years of placing fresh flowers, cleaning the headstone, trimming the grass around it. 15 years waiting to see her son show up even once." Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The nurses and doctors around them began whispering among themselves, clearly shocked by the revelation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. How do you know that name?" Robert managed to stammer, his arrogance replaced by pure panic. Frank smiled sadly. "Because I knew your mother, Dr. Robert, knew her very well." The doctor felt his legs weaken even more. The hospital reception had become a stage where his private life was being exposed in the most humiliating way possible. "That's a lie," Robert said, trying to regain his composure. "You're making this up to get back at me for my jokes." "Jokes," Frank repeated, his voice deepening. "You call 15 years of constant humiliation a joke?" The head nurse, Eleanor Thompson, a gray-haired woman who had worked at the hospital for over 20 years, approached the group. She had known Robert's mother years ago, and now stared at the doctor with growing disapproval. "Robert," Eleanor said slowly, "was your mother's name really Margaret?" Robert couldn't answer right away. Frank seized the silence. "Mrs. Margaret spent the last 5 years of her life at Golden Sunset Retirement Home, over on Magnolia Street. My wife, Dorothy, worked there as a caregiver for 10 years. She used to tell me your mother asked about her son every day." Frank's words hit Robert like punches to the gut. He vaguely remembered the nursing home, the few obligatory visits he'd made, always in a hurry, always making excuses to leave quickly. "She spoke of you with such pride," Frank continued, his voice now soft, almost tender. "She said her son was a doctor, that he saved lives. But she also cried, Dr. Robert. She cried because you never came." Eleanor covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes filling with tears. Other hospital staff had discreetly gathered around, all shocked by the revelation. Dorothy would come home and tell me how Mrs. Margaret would sit by the window waiting. Every Sunday she'd get dressed, fix her hair, put on the blue dress you gave her as a gift for some birthday. And she'd wait. Robert squeezed his eyes shut, the memories he'd tried to bury rushing back with painful clarity. The blue dress. He remembered buying it thoughtlessly, at some random store, just to fulfill the obligation of giving a gift. "You have no right," Robert muttered, trying to summon anger where there was only pain. "Right to what?" Frank replied. "To tend the grave you abandoned? To clean the headstone you never visited? To put flowers there in place of the son who never shows up?" Dr. Samuel Williams, one of the hospital's most senior cardiologists, stepped closer to the group. He had been Robert's friend many years ago, but had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his colleague's cruel behavior lately. "Robert," Samuel said quietly, "is what he's saying true?" Robert couldn't answer. Frank continued, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality that held everyone's attention. "Do you know the last thing your mother said to me, Dr. Robert? Dorothy was helping her out of her chair, and she grabbed my wife's hand tight. She said, 'Tell Frank that if my son ever comes to the cemetery, he'll recognize the yellow flowers. I always put yellow flowers on the table when he was little.'" Tears began rolling down Robert's face uncontrollably. The image of his mother placing yellow flowers on the table in the small house where he grew up came back with a clarity that left him breathless. "Yellow flowers," Frank repeated softly. "Every Sunday for 15 years, I've put yellow flowers on her grave. Yellow daisies, because they were her favorite." "How do you know that?" Robert asked, his voice now barely a whisper. "Because I learned from her," Frank answered. "Your mother was my teacher, Dr. Robert. Mrs. Margaret taught me how to read and write." The shock of this revelation struck Robert like lightning. He stared at Frank wide-eyed, trying to process the information. "Impossible," he murmured. "Lincoln Public School, Hopeville. Your mother taught adult literacy classes every Tuesday and Thursday night. I was 17 and couldn't even write my own name." Frank smiled, and for the first time since the conversation began, there was something beyond sadness in his expression. "She never charged a dime. Said education was the greatest gift anyone could give. 2 years of lessons, Dr. Robert. 2 years in which your mother gave me the chance to have a better life." Robert slumped heavily into one of the reception chairs, his mind struggling to process all this information. The other hospital staff remained in respectful silence, sensing they were witnessing something deeply personal and transformative. "That's why," Frank continued, "when I found out Mrs. Margaret was at Holy Cross Cemetery and no one was tending to the grave, I started going there on Sundays. At first it was just gratitude, you know, a way to repay what she did for me. But after a while I realized I was doing it out of love too. Love for the woman who gave me dignity, who treated me like a person when the whole world saw me as just another ignorant fool." Eleanor stepped closer to Robert and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Robert, dear," she said softly, "your mother always spoke of you so fondly when she came to visit some patients here at the hospital. She was so proud." "She came here?" Robert asked, looking up in surprise. "Oh yes," Eleanor confirmed. "Once a month, she always brought homemade sweets to the pediatric ward. The children adored Mrs. Margaret. She told stories, taught them old songs." Frank nodded. "She really did that. Dorothy always said your mother had a heart of gold. She helped everyone she could." Robert felt a deep ache spreading through his chest. He was beginning to realize just how much he had lost, how much of his mother's final years he had wasted. I was always so busy," Robert murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Busy," Frank repeated, no judgment in his voice, just endless sadness. "Yes, Dr. Robert. Your mother knew you were busy. She always made excuses for you, said saving lives was more important than visiting an old woman. But do you know what she wanted most? It wasn't money, it wasn't expensive gifts. She just wanted to talk to her son, hear about his work, about the patients he saved. She wanted to feel like part of her son's life. Dr. Samuel crouched beside Robert. "Friend, you never told us your mother had passed." Robert looked at his colleague through tears. "I don't like talking about it." "Don't like it? Or are you ashamed?" Frank asked, his question cutting deep. "Ashamed of what?" Robert shot back, a spark of anger returning to his eyes. "Ashamed of where you came from, Dr. Robert. Ashamed of the modest home, the teacher mother who barely made ends meet, the humble life you had before becoming this important doctor." Frank's words hit their mark with surgical precision. Robert felt exposed, as if all his masks had been ripped away at once. "Your mother was never ashamed of you," Frank continued. "Even when you stopped visiting, even when you changed your number without telling her, even when you made excuses not to show up for important dates. She always said, 'My son is a doctor, he's saving lives.'" "Stop," Robert whispered, covering his face with his hands. "But maybe she should have been ashamed," Frank said, his voice hardening in a way that surprised everyone. "Ashamed of the son who abandoned her, the son who forgot every value she taught him, the son who became a small petty man belittling others to feel superior." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. The silence that followed was broken only by muffled sobs. Robert was weeping, the full weight of years of neglect and arrogance crashing down on him all at once. "Frank," Eleanor said hesitantly, "maybe you should..." "Should what?" Frank interrupted. "Should I have stayed quiet while he humiliates me every day? Should I pretend I don't know what kind of man he's become?" Frank stepped closer to Robert and bent down to meet his eye level. "Dr. Robert, do you want to know how your mother really spent her last days? Do you want to hear the truth no one had the courage to tell you?" Robert looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "She died alone," Frank said simply. "Dorothy was off duty. It was a Sunday morning. When they came to check the rooms, she was already gone. Peacefully, they say, but alone. They tried calling you. The number on file didn't work anymore. They tried reaching you through the hospital, but you were away at some conference." Robert vaguely remembered the trip, a conference in Washington, D.C., 5 days in a luxury hotel, fancy dinners, lectures on innovative surgical techniques. "The funeral was simple," Frank continued. "Dorothy and I paid for it. A few of your mother's neighbors showed up, some of her former students, 10 people at most. We waited for you until the last minute." "I didn't know," Robert murmured. "You didn't know because you didn't want to," Frank shot back. "How many times did your mother try to talk to you this past year? How many times did you hang up saying you were busy?" Robert couldn't answer. The memories of unanswered calls, ignored messages, made-up excuses, all came back with painful clarity. "You know what makes me saddest, Dr. Robert?" Frank said, his voice softening again. "Your mother died believing she had failed as a mother, believing she hadn't raised her son right." "That's not true," Robert protested weakly. "No? Then explain to me how the kindest woman I ever knew raised a man who enjoys humiliating others." The question hung in the air like a verdict. The hospital staff stood silent, many visibly moved by what they were witnessing. Dr. Samuel placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Frank, I think we all owe you an apology here. We should never have allowed Robert to treat you this way." Frank nodded. "Dr. Samuel, you've always treated me with respect. You don't need to apologize for others." "But I do," Samuel insisted. "Silence is its own form of complicity." Eleanor stepped closer to Frank. "Frank, dear, you knew Robert's mother better than any of us. What was she like?" For the first time since the conversation began, Frank smiled, a genuine warm smile. "Mrs. Margaret was special. She had this way of making everyone feel important. When she taught, she'd look at each student like they were the smartest person in the world. I remember once, I was struggling to write the word hope. So many letters, you know. She took my hand, placed it over hers, and we wrote it together, letter by letter. When we finished, she said, 'Frank, now you can write the most important word in the world. Because without hope we can't achieve anything. Robert listened as if hearing about his mother for the first time. He was beginning to realize he'd lost far more than he'd ever imagined. "Did she talk about me?" Robert asked hesitantly. "She did," Frank confirmed. "Especially when teaching. She used you as an example. She'd say, 'My son studied hard, he persevered, now he's a doctor. You can achieve anything too if you don't give up.' But over time the stories changed. She spoke less about you as her son and more like a distant memory, someone she loved, but who wasn't part of her life anymore." Robert stood abruptly, pacing back and forth, his hands trembling. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said, more to himself. I wanted to build a better life. I wanted to be someone important." "And you succeeded," said Frank. "You are important. You're a respected doctor. You save lives. But you forgot one essential thing." "What?" "That a truly important person is one who remembers where they came from, who honors those who helped them get where they are, who uses their success to lift others up, not put them down." The nurse Emily, a young woman around 30 who had always suffered from Robert's sarcastic remarks, hesitantly approached the group. "Dr. Robert," she said timidly, "I also wanted to say something." Robert turned to her, his eyes still red. "My grandmother knew your mother. They lived on the same street when I was little. Mrs. Margaret always helped my grandmother with groceries, especially when she got sick. My grandmother always said Mrs. Margaret was an angel, that even though she earned little as a teacher, she always found a way to help those in need." Robert felt another wave of emotion. The stories about his mother were multiplying, each one revealing a side of her he had chosen to ignore. "There's one more thing," said Frank, hesitating. "Mrs. Margaret left some things behind. Dorothy brought them to me after she passed." "What kind of things?" asked Robert, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank looked around, realizing they had drawn a small crowd. Staff from different departments of the hospital had quietly joined the group, all clearly moved by the conversation. "Maybe we should talk in private," Frank suggested. "No," Robert said firmly. "If you have something to say about my mother, you can say it in front of everyone. I don't deserve privacy after how I've treated you all these years." Frank nodded slowly. "She left letters, Dr. Robert. Letters she wrote to you but never sent." Robert felt his legs weaken again. "Letters?" Dorothy found a shoebox under her bed. There were over 20 letters, all addressed to you. Some for birthdays, some for Christmas, others just out of longing. Can I see them?" Frank hesitated. "I can bring them tomorrow if you'd like. But there's one condition." "Any condition." "You have to promise me you'll read every single one, from start to finish, and after you read them you have to tell me if you still think humiliating others is the best way to feel important." Robert nodded vigorously. I promise anything." Dr. Samuel placed an arm around Robert's shoulders. "Robert, I think we all need some time to process this. Why don't you take the rest of the day off?" "No," Robert said, straightening up. "No, I need to work. I need to remember why I became a doctor." He turned to Frank, who watched him with an unreadable expression. "Frank, I don't know how to apologize for 15 years of—" "It's not time for apologies yet," Frank interrupted. "First, you need to truly understand what you've done, not just to me, but to your mother's memory." Robert nodded, accepting the reprimand. "You're right. Tomorrow I'll bring the letters, and I'll also bring some photos." "Photos?" "Of the grave, how I found it, and how it looks now, so you can see what 15 years of neglect do to a person's memory." The conversation was interrupted by the beep of Robert's pager. He looked at the device and saw it was an emergency in the operating room. "I have to go," he said hesitantly. "Go," said Frank. "Go save lives. That's what your mother always said you did best." Robert started to walk away, but stopped and turned back. "Frank." "Yes, Dr. Robert." "Thank you." Frank didn't answer, but gave a slight nod. When Robert disappeared down the hallway toward the surgical center, the group of staff members remained silent for a few moments. "Frank," Eleanor finally said, "you did the right thing." "I don't know," replied Frank, turning back to tend to the plants. "Maybe I was too hard on him." "No, you weren't," said Dr. Samuel. "Someone needed to tell him the truth, and you were the right person to do it." "Why?" "Because you knew his mother. You know what kind of person she was, and you can help him remember who he's supposed to be." Frank kept working, but his thoughts were far from the plants. He was thinking about Dorothy, how surprised she would be when she heard what had happened. He was thinking about Mrs. Margaret and whether she would approve of what he'd done. Mostly, he was wondering if there was any real chance Dr. Robert Miller could become the kind of man his mother had raised him to be. In the surgical center, Robert prepared for a complex heart bypass surgery, but his hands, usually steady and precise, trembled slightly as he washed them. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Michael, noticed Robert's unsettled state. "Everything all right, Robert? You seem shaken." Robert looked down at his soapy hands in the water, hands that saved lives, but had also been used to belittle others. "Michael, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think a person can really change? After years of being one way, is it possible to become someone completely different?" Michael studied him curiously. "Where's this coming from?" "It's just, I've been thinking about some things I've done, people I've hurt. I wonder if there's still time to fix it." "Robert, I've known you for 10 years. You're an excellent surgeon, but you've always been difficult with people." "Difficult?" "You know, arrogant, sometimes cruel. I always thought it was because you were compensating for something." Robert stopped washing and looked at Michael through the mirror. "Compensating for what?" "I don't know. Insecurity, maybe? Fear of not being good enough? I've seen it in other doctors. The more insecure they feel inside, the more they need to prove they're superior to others." Michael's words echoed in Robert's mind as he entered the operating room. Could it be that all his arrogance was just a mask to hide his own insecurities? The surgery lasted 4 hours. The whole time, Robert stayed focused, but his mind occasionally wandered to Frank's words, to the letters his mother had written but never sent. When the surgery ended successfully, Robert felt strangely empty. Normally, after a complex, successful operation, he'd feel triumphant, superior. Today, he only felt a deep sadness. In the locker room, as he changed, his phone rang. It was his ex-wife, Catherine. "Robert, is everything okay? You sound off." "Off how?" "Your voice. You sound sad." Robert hesitated. He and Catherine had divorced 3 years ago, mostly because she couldn't take his difficult personality and constant mood swings anymore. "Catherine, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you really divorce me?" There was silence on the other end. "Robert, we've talked about this." "No, I mean the real reason, not the polite excuses we gave everyone else." Catherine sighed. "Do you really want to know?" "I do." "You became a bitter person, Robert. You always had to feel superior to everyone. It was impossible to have a normal conversation without you attacking someone or making a cruel remark. And you know what saddened me the most? I knew the man you were when we first met. You were kind, generous, a dreamer. But over time, he turned into someone I no longer recognized." Robert closed his eyes. "What do you think changed me?" "I don't know, Robert. Maybe success went to your head. Maybe you started believing you were better than others just because you had a medical degree. Or maybe—" She hesitated. "What?" "Maybe you grew angry at where you came from. I remember you always got uncomfortable when I asked about your family, about your childhood. It was like you were ashamed of your past." Catherine's words hit the same raw nerve Frank had touched earlier. Robert sank heavily onto the locker room bench. "Catherine, my mother died 3 years ago." "I know, Robert. I was at the funeral." "You were?" "Yes. You didn't see me because you arrived late and left before it ended. But I was there." Robert didn't remember seeing Catherine at the funeral. In truth, he remembered very little of that day. He'd been late due to an emergency surgery, stayed only a few minutes, and rushed back to the hospital. "Why did you go?" "Because I liked your mother, Robert. Mrs. Margaret was always kind to me, and because I thought you needed support, even though we were divorced. I didn't see many people there. There were more than you think. You just left too quickly to notice." Robert vaguely recalled seeing unfamiliar faces at the funeral, but had assumed they were in the wrong place. "Catherine, do you think there's still time for me to become a better person?" "Robert, you've always been a better person beneath all that armor you built. You just need to remember who you really are." After hanging up, Robert remained seated in the empty locker room for over an hour. He mentally retraced his entire life, every choice he'd made, every person he'd hurt. When he finally stood to leave, he'd made a decision. The next day, no matter what his mother's letters said, he would start trying to fix his mistakes. But first, he had one stop to make. Robert drove to Holy Cross Cemetery. It was nearly 7 in the evening when he arrived, and the cemetery was already closed to visitors. But he managed to persuade the guard to let him in briefly. Following Frank's directions, he found Section B. Grave number 347 was exactly where Frank had said it would be. What Robert saw left him breathless. The grave was immaculate. The headstone gleamed as if freshly polished. The grass around it was perfectly trimmed, and there was a vase of fresh yellow daisies clearly placed that same day. Robert knelt before the headstone and for the first time in years wept openly. He cried for the mother he'd lost, for the wasted years, for the words left unspoken. But mostly he cried for the man he'd become and the distance he'd created between himself and everyone around him. As he wept, Robert noticed a small plaque beside the main headstone. It was simple, with the inscription, "Flowers are refreshed weekly in memory of a great teacher. With love, her students." Robert realized Frank wasn't the only former student of his mother's who tended to the grave. There was an entire community of people she'd touched who still honored her memory, people his mother had helped and educated, while her own son had neglected her. When Robert finally rose to leave, he silently promised his mother he'd return the next day, and this time he'd bring his own flowers. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The next morning, Robert arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. He had slept little, his nights filled with restless dreams about his mother and long-buried memories. Frank was already in the entrance garden, watering the plants with his usual dedication. When he saw Robert approaching, he stopped what he was doing and straightened up. "Good morning, Dr. Robert." "Good morning, Frank." Robert's voice was softer than Frank had ever heard it. "Did you bring—" Frank gestured to an old backpack leaning against one of the planters. "Yes, I did. But before I hand it over, I want you to see something." Frank opened the backpack and pulled out a manila envelope. From it, he took out a series of photographs. "This is how I found your mother's grave on the first day," he said, handing Robert the first photo. Robert looked at the image and felt his stomach twist. The headstone was dirty, covered in moss. The grass had grown wildly around it, and trash was scattered across the site. "And this is how it looks today," Frank said, showing the second photo. The difference was like night and day. The same grave Robert had visited the night before, now immaculate and lovingly tended. "Frank, Robert began, but Frank gently interrupted. "I'm not finished yet, Dr. Robert." Frank pulled more photos from the envelope. They showed the grave at different times of the year, revealing how Frank had gradually restored and improved the site. "This one was when I built the low fence around it to protect the flowers," Frank explained. "This was when I brought fresh soil and planted new grass. And this was when I added the alumni plaque." Robert studied each photo with growing attention. He could clearly see that Frank had spent not only time, but also considerable money caring for the grave. How much did you spend on all this?" Robert asked. Frank shrugged. "It doesn't matter. I didn't do it for money. But it matters to me. I should have been the one to take care of it." "You should have," Frank agreed simply. "But you weren't. So I did." Frank put the photos away and pulled an old shoebox from the backpack, tied with a faded blue ribbon. "These are the letters," he said, handing the box to Robert. Robert took the box with trembling hands. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. How many letters are there? 23. The first is from 5 years ago. The last is from 2 weeks before she passed. Robert opened the box slowly. The letters were organized by date, all in envelopes addressed to him but clearly never sent. Why did she never mail them? Dorothy says your mother would start writing when she missed you, but then she gets scared of being a bother. She said her son was too busy to read letters from an old lady. Robert picked up the first letter. On the envelope, written in the careful handwriting he remembered from childhood, it read, "To my dear son Robert, with all my love, Mom." Can I read them now? You promised you'd read all of them. I suggest you take them home and read them at your own pace. When you're done, if you want to talk about them, I'm here. Robert held the box to his chest as if it were a priceless treasure. Frank, there's one more thing I need to know. What? Your wife, Dorothy. Does she still work at the retirement home? No. She stopped working there after Mrs. Margaret passed. Now she works at a daycare in Hopeville. Says she prefers caring for the beginning of life rather than the end. I'd like to meet her, to thank her for everything she did for my mother. Frank studied him carefully. Are you sure? Absolutely. Then come over for dinner tonight. Dorothy always enjoys having visitors. Robert was surprised by the invitation. You're sure? After everything I've done? Dr. Robert, I didn't hold a grudge against you even when you were humiliating me. I won't start now that you're trying to change. How can you be so sure I'm trying to change? Frank smiled. Because I know Mrs. Margaret's son. He might have lost his way, but he's still in there somewhere. For the rest of the day, Robert tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to the box of letters he'd left in his office. Several times he went in just to stare at it, but couldn't bring himself to open it. In the afternoon, an emergency came into the ER. A car accident had left 3 people injured, and Robert was called in to operate on the most critical case. As he prepped for surgery, he remembered his mother's words, the ones Frank had mentioned, "My son saves lives." During the operation, an extremely delicate 6-hour procedure, Robert felt reconnected to the original purpose that had drawn him to medicine. It wasn't about prestige or superiority. It was about using his skills to help others. When the surgery ended successfully, he felt a satisfaction unlike his usual pride. It wasn't arrogance or ego, just the pure sense of having made a difference in someone's life. In the locker room as he changed, Dr. Samuel approached. "Beautiful work, Robert. That patient was lucky to have you." "Samuel, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you never confront me about how I treated Frank and the other staff?" Samuel sighed. "Honestly? Because I was a coward. It was easier to pretend I didn't see it than to start a conflict with you." "But you knew it was wrong?" "I did, and I feel guilty about it. Frank is one of the best employees in this hospital. He knows every plant, every flower bed, every detail of the garden. More than that, he's respected by everyone here. Everyone likes him, except you." "Why does everyone like him?" "Because he's genuine, Robert. He treats everyone with respect, from the hospital director to the janitor. He remembers staff members' kids' birthdays, asks about their families, helps when someone's struggling." "And me?" Samuel hesitated. You've always been very self-focused, always concerned with your reputation, your successes, your position. I've never seen you show real interest in other people." The words stung, but Robert knew they were true. "Samuel, do you think there's still time for me to change that?" "Robert, you've changed more in the last 24 hours than in the last 10 years. Of course there's time." At 7 that evening, Robert stood at the door of a modest home in Hopeville, holding a bouquet of yellow daisies and a bottle of wine. He'd spent nearly an hour picking the flowers, wanting to be sure they were the kind his mother had loved. Frank opened the door wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. Without his hospital uniform, he looked younger, more relaxed. "Dr. Robert, welcome to our home. Please just call me Robert," Frank smiled. "All right, Robert." The house was small but impeccably kept. Lush plants filled the windowsills, and a small but stunning garden bloomed in the backyard. "Dorothy," Frank called, "our guest is here." A woman around 50 stepped out of the kitchen, drying her hands on an apron. She had a warm smile and kind eyes that instantly reminded Robert of his own mother. "You must be Robert," Dorothy said, extending her hand. "Frank's told me so much about you." "I hope not all of it was bad," Robert said, trying to joke. Dorothy laughed. "Actually, Frank always talked more about his mother than about you." "Mrs. Margaret was a very special person," continued Dorothy, leading them to the living room. "Taking care of her was a privilege. The room was simple but cozy, with many plants and a few family photos scattered on the shelves. Robert noticed a photo of a young man in a military uniform displayed prominently. "This is our son Brian," explained Frank, noticing Robert's gaze. "He was a soldier." "Was?" asked Robert, immediately regretting the question. "He passed away 5 years ago," Dorothy said softly. "An accident during military training." Robert felt a wave of shame. Frank had lost a son, yet he had never shown bitterness or used it as an excuse to treat others poorly. "I'm so sorry," Robert said sincerely. "Thank you," replied Frank. "It was after Brian's passing that I started tending to your mother's grave. Dorothy thought I was transferring my grief, but I was really finding a way to honor the memory of 2 people I loved." During dinner, Dorothy shared stories about Robert's mother that he had never heard before. Stories about how she helped other residents at the retirement home, her endless patience, and how she always found something positive to say in any situation. "You know what impressed me most about your mother?" Dorothy said. "She never complained. Even when she was feeling unwell, even when she missed you, she always found something to be grateful for. She talked about you a lot," Dorothy continued. "She always said she had raised a wonderful son, a doctor who saved lives. She was so proud." "But I rarely visited," Robert interrupted. "She knew that," Dorothy said gently. "But she chose to focus on pride rather than sadness. She said you were doing something too important to waste time on an old lady." "She wasn't just an old lady," Robert murmured. "No, she wasn't," Dorothy agreed. "She was a teacher, an educator, a woman who touched hundreds of lives, including my husband's." Frank nodded. "Mrs. Margaret gave me the chance to have a better life. If it weren't for her, I'd still be illiterate." "And now you use that gift to care for beautiful things," Robert said, looking out the window at the garden. "My mother would be proud." "She was proud," Dorothy corrected. "Frank always told her about his work at the hospital. She was happy knowing he was using what he learned to create beauty." After dinner, Frank took Robert to see the garden in the backyard. It was small but extraordinarily well kept, with an impressive variety of plants and flowers. "This is where I test new species before taking them to the hospital," Frank explained. "And it's also where I come when I need to think." "It's beautiful," Robert said sincerely. "It must take a lot of work." "It does, but it's work I love. Every plant has its own personality, its own needs. It's like caring for people in a way." Robert looked around the garden, noticing the careful details, how every element was perfectly placed. "Frank, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "How do you manage not to be angry? You lost a son, work hard for little pay, were humiliated for years. How do you not grow bitter?" Frank thought for a moment before answering. "You know, Robert, after Brian passed, I was very angry for a while. Angry at the world, angry at God, angry at everything. But the anger was eating me up inside. It was your mother who helped me through it." "My mother?" "She said something I'll never forget. She said anger is like a poison we drink, hoping the other person will die. That forgiving isn't about the person who hurt us, it's about our own peace. And she also said that every day we spend angry is a day we steal from our own happiness." Robert absorbed those words in silence. "So when you humiliated me at the hospital, I remembered her words. And instead of getting angry, I tried to understand why you needed to do that. And what conclusion did you reach? That you were suffering inside, that someone who is truly happy doesn't need to belittle others to feel good." Frank's words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. That was exactly what he had done for years, tried to feel better by putting others down. "Frank," I need to ask you a difficult question. Go ahead. Can you forgive me? For the years of humiliation, the disrespect, for everything. Frank turned to face Robert directly. Robert, I forgave you a long time ago. The forgiveness wasn't for you. It was for me. Because holding on to resentment was hurting me. But now you need to forgive yourself. And that's much harder. Robert felt tears forming in his eyes. I don't know if I can. Your mother would, Frank said softly. She always could forgive. Always believed people could change. Maybe you should try to see yourself through her eyes. When Robert returned home that night carrying the box of letters, he felt as if he had undergone a fundamental transformation. For the first time in years, he had had a genuine conversation with others. No masks, no pretenses. In his luxurious but cold apartment, Robert sat in his favorite armchair and opened the first letter from his mother. My dear son Robert, the letter began. Today is your 35th birthday, and I'm sitting here thinking about how quickly time has passed. I remember when you were little, blowing out the candles on the cakes I made, always wishing to be a doctor when you grew up. Robert stopped reading and closed his eyes. He remembered those birthdays, the simple cakes his mother made with so much love. Now you're a real doctor, and I feel so proud. I know you're very busy saving lives, and I understand why you can't visit often. I just want you to know I think of you every day and pray that you're happy. The letter went on for 2 pages, filled with tender memories and words of encouragement. There were no complaints, no demands, just unconditional love. Robert read letter after letter, each one revealing more about his mother's generous heart and his own blindness. In some letters, she mentioned health problems he hadn't even known about. In others, she talked about her former students who still visited her, including Frank. One letter in particular moved him deeply. Today, Frank came to visit and brought pictures of the hospital garden where he works. He said you're the most talented doctor he knows, but that you sometimes seem sad. I hope you find joy in your life, my son. Success means nothing if it isn't accompanied by happiness. Robert realized his mother had known about his struggles before he did. She had seen through all his masks and loved him unconditionally anyway. The last letter was the hardest to read. My dear Robert, I don't know if this will be my last letter to you, but I feel my time is coming to an end. I want you to know you are the greatest pride of my life. I may not have been the perfect mother, but I tried my best. If something happens to me, I don't want you to feel guilty. I know you have an important life, important responsibilities. I only ask one thing, be kind to people. Remember that everyone is fighting their own battles, and if one day you meet Frank at the hospital, be good to him. He's a special man who learned to find beauty even after great pain. He can teach you important things about life. With all my eternal love, Mom. Robert cried until he had no tears left. His mother had died asking him to be kind to the very person he had spent years humiliating. It was almost midnight when he finished reading all the letters. Sitting in his silent apartment, Robert felt more alone than ever. But he also felt something he hadn't experienced in years: determination to change. The next day, Robert arrived at the hospital with a plan. First, he looked for Frank in the garden. Frank, I read all the letters. Frank stopped watering the plants and turned to him. And how do you feel? Destroyed, admitted Robert, but also determined. I want to change, Frank. I want to become the kind of person my mother believed I was. And how do you plan to do that? I want to start by asking you something. I want you to teach me. Frank raised his eyebrows. Teach you what? How to be a better person. How to treat people with respect. How to find joy in simple things. Everything my mother taught you and what you've learned from experience. Frank considered the request carefully. It won't be easy, Robert. Changing years of habits takes time. I have time, and I have motivation. All right, Frank finally said. But there's one condition. Any condition. You have to be willing to humble yourself, to admit when you're wrong, to apologize when you hurt someone, and most of all, to listen to criticism without defending yourself. Robert swallowed hard. Those were exactly the hardest things for him. I accept. Then let's start now. Come with me. Frank led Robert to the hospital cafeteria where many staff members were having breakfast. See that table over there? Frank pointed to a group of nurses. You've humiliated every single one of them at some point over the past few years. Robert's stomach twisted. What do you want me to do? Go over there and apologize, sincerely. In front of everyone. In front of everyone. If you really want to change, you need to start by fixing the damage you've done. Robert took a deep breath and walked over to the nurses' table. As he approached, the conversation stopped, and they all looked at him warily. Excuse me, Robert said, his voice slightly trembling. I'd like to speak with you all. About what, Dr. Robert? Asked Emily, the youngest nurse, with a cautious expression. About the past few years, about how I've treated you. Robert paused and took another breath. I've come to apologize. The silence in the cafeteria spread to nearby tables. Other staff members began paying attention to the conversation. I know I've spent years being cruel to you, making unnecessary remarks, treating you as if you were beneath me, and I want you to know that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with my own issues. There's no excuse for what I did, but I hope you can forgive me, and I promise I'll work to be a better person. The nurses exchanged surprised glances. None of them had expected an apology from Robert, let alone a public and sincere one. Dr. Robert, said Eleanor, the head nurse, who had joined the group, this is unexpected. I know it is, Robert agreed, and I know an apology doesn't erase years of bad behavior, but it's a start. What changed? Emily asked. Robert looked around the cafeteria, seeing that nearly everyone was watching. I learned some things about my mother, about the kind of person she was and the kind of person she wanted me to be, and I realized I've become the exact opposite of that. Your mother was a teacher, wasn't she? Asked one of the older nurses. She was, and from what I've recently discovered, she was an extraordinary woman who helped many people, including some here at this hospital. Robert looked toward Frank, who had remained at a distance watching. Frank helped me understand how far I'd strayed from the values my mother tried to teach me, and now I want to try honoring her memory by being a better person. Eleanor stood and placed a hand on Robert's arm. Dr. Robert, we all go through hard times. What matters is that you're willing to change. Thank you, said Robert, clearly moved. That means a lot to me. When Robert returned to Frank's side, the man was smiling. How do you feel? Terrified, Robert admitted, but also relieved in a way. This is just the beginning, said Frank. Now you need to prove this change is real, not just words. How? By being consistent, treating everyone with respect every day. Not just when you have an audience or when you're feeling guilty. Frank, can I ask you a favor? What favor? Can you call me out when I slip back into old habits? I know it'll happen, and I'll need someone to keep me on track. Frank considered the request. I can do that, but you have to promise you won't get angry when I point out your mistakes. I promise. In the following weeks, Robert worked consciously to change his behavior. He began greeting every staff member by name, asking about their families, expressing gratitude for their work. At first, many employees were suspicious of the change, assuming it was temporary or manipulative. But as days passed and Robert maintained his new demeanor, people began relaxing around him. Frank kept his promise to point out when Robert slipped into old habits, and surprisingly, Robert kept his promise to accept criticism without defensiveness. A month after the initial confrontation, Robert was making his morning rounds when he found Frank tending a new flower bed near pediatrics. Good morning, Frank. How's the new project coming? Morning, Robert. It's going well. The kids will love these colorful flowers. Frank, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you think my mother would be proud of the person I'm trying to become? Frank stopped working and looked at Robert. Over the past weeks, he'd seen genuine changes in the doctor, not just surface behavior, but in how he treated people, the patience he showed, the humility he was developing. You know, Robert, I think your mother was always proud of you. Even when you were lost, she saw the man you could be. But now I think she'd be more than proud. I think she'd be radiant. Robert smiled, and Frank noticed it was genuine, not the forced, arrogant smirk he used to wear. Thank you, Frank, for everything. For caring for my mother when I didn't, for tending her grave when I abandoned her, and most of all, for not giving up on me when I didn't deserve a second chance. Everyone deserves a second chance, Robert. Your mother taught me that. She was wise. She was, and you're starting to honor that wisdom. As Robert continued his rounds, Frank returned to the flower bed. He thought of Mrs. Margaret and wondered if she knew, wherever she was, that her son was finally becoming the man she'd always believed he could be. That afternoon, Robert received an unexpected call. It was Catherine, his ex-wife. "Robert, it's me. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Of course, Catherine. Is something wrong?" "Actually, I wanted to talk about you. Some people told me you've changed, that you're treating people differently at the hospital." Robert sat at his desk, curious where this was going. "It's true. I'm trying to be a better person." "What happened? What made you change?" Robert told Catherine about the confrontation with Frank, about his mother's letters, about everything he had discovered in the past few weeks. "My God, Robert," Catherine said when he finished. "I always knew there was a good man beneath all that bitterness. I'm so happy you found him." "Catherine, can I ask you something?" "Of course." Do you think we could meet in person to talk? Not about getting back together," he quickly clarified, "but about settling things between us properly." There was a pause before Catherine answered. "I'd love that, Robert. I always wanted us to end up as friends." They agreed to meet over the weekend, and for the first time in years, Robert felt hopeful about mending another relationship he had damaged. 2 weeks later, Robert was at Holy Cross Cemetery, kneeling beside his mother's grave. He had started visiting every week, always bringing fresh yellow daisies. "Hi, Mum," he said softly, replacing last week's flowers. "I have some things to tell you. First, I met Dorothy, Frank's wife. She told me wonderful stories about you at the retirement home, made me realize I lost so much more than I knew by not visiting you. And I got to know Frank better. Mom, you raised an extraordinary man when you taught him to read. He's everything I should have been all these years, kind, generous, humble, resilient. I also apologize to a lot of people I hurt. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And you know what? Most of them forgave me, just like you always did. I'm trying to be the son you deserved. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I promise I'll try every day." Robert stayed silent for a few minutes, just feeling the quiet presence of the place. The grave looked beautiful, clearly tended with love by Frank all those weeks. "Frank told me you always believed people could change. I hope you were right, Mum, because I really need to." As Robert stood to leave, he saw Frank arriving with a small watering can and some gardening tools. "Hi, Frank, I came to visit my mum." "Hi, Robert. How was the talk?" "Good. Hard, but good." Robert hesitated. "Frank, can I join you while you tend to the grave? I'd like to learn." Frank smiled. "Of course, it'd be an honor." For an hour, Frank taught Robert how to properly care for the plants around the grave. He showed him how to trim wilted flowers, water without overdoing it, and keep the grass neat. "It's more complicated than it looks," Robert remarked, his hands covered in dirt. "Most important things are," Frank replied, "but it's rewarding when you see the results. Like changing as a person. Exactly like changing as a person." When they finished, Robert looked at his dirty hands and remembered the last time he'd touched soil, when he was about 10, helping his mother in the small garden behind their childhood home. "Frank, can I make you an offer?" "What offer?" "How about I come here every Sunday morning? I can help you tend to the grave, and maybe you could teach me more about gardening." Frank considered it. "You sure? It's a serious commitment." "I'm sure. I want to honor my mom in a real way, not just with words." "Then I accept, but on one condition." Robert laughed. "You always have conditions. This one's simple. You bring your own tools and gloves. If you're doing this, you're doing it right." "Deal." The following Sunday, Robert showed up at the cemetery with a full set of gardening tools and new gloves. Frank was waiting with a smile. "Ready to get your hands really dirty?" "More than ready." They worked side by side for 2 hours, tending not only to the grave of Robert's mother, but also to several other graves Frank had adopted over the years. "Why do you take care of graves of people you didn't even know?" Robert asked. "Because everyone deserves to be remembered," Frank replied, "and because caring for others, even after they're gone, is a way of caring for our own soul." As they worked, Frank shared more stories about Robert's mother, and Robert recalled childhood memories he had nearly forgotten. "You know," Robert said, pausing in his work, "this is the first time in years I've felt truly at peace." "Why?" "Because for the first time, I'm doing something out of love, not obligation or ego. I'm here because I want to be, honoring my mother's memory, because she deserves it." "That's the difference," Frank said, "between doing something because you have to and doing it because it's the right thing to do." When they finished, they sat on a nearby bench to rest. The cemetery was quiet, only the sound of birds breaking the silence. "Frank, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "Yesterday, I was at the hospital, and one of the nurses brought her son to meet me, a boy about 8 years old who wants to be a doctor when he grows up. And you know what I did? Instead of just giving a quick hello like I would have before, I sat with him for 15 minutes. I explained what it's like to be a doctor, showed him a stethoscope, let him listen to his own heartbeat. The boy was thrilled, and his mother was so moved she started crying." Frank smiled. "How did that make you feel?" "Amazing. Better than any complicated surgery I've ever done, because I saw that I was planting a seed in that child's heart." "Your mother used to say that," Frank said. "That teaching wasn't about passing on knowledge. It was about planting seeds of possibility." "She really said that." "She did, and now you're doing the same thing she did." 3 months had passed since the initial confrontation between Robert and Frank. The change in the doctor hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone at the hospital. Dr. Samuel remarked to colleagues that Robert seemed like a completely different man. Eleanor, the head nurse, noticed the work atmosphere had improved significantly since Robert started treating everyone with respect. But the most remarkable change was in how Robert interacted with patients. He had always been a skilled surgeon, but now he had also become a compassionate doctor. One morning, Robert was checking on an elderly patient who had undergone heart surgery when the man took his hand. "Doctor, can I tell you something?" "Of course, Mr. Wilson. What is it?" "You remind me of my son. He's a doctor too, but he never has time to talk to me the way you do." The patient's words struck Robert like lightning. He saw himself in the position of the absent son, and for the first time, understood how his own patients must have felt when he was rushed and distant. "Mr. Wilson, if you'd like, I can call your son and explain your condition to him. Sometimes we doctors forget that our families need to understand what's happening." Mr. Wilson's eyes filled with tears. "You'd do that?" "Of course." After speaking with Mr. Wilson's son and carefully explaining his father's condition, Robert headed to the hospital garden, where he knew he'd find Frank. "How was your day?" Frank asked, looking up from a rosebush he was pruning. "Eye-opening," Robert replied. "I had a patient who made me realize how I'd been with my own mother." Robert told Frank about Mr. Wilson and the call he'd made. "And you know what else? His son came to visit during lunch. First time in 2 months he's shown up." "How do you feel about that?" "Good. Useful. As if he had helped fix something important." Frank smiled. "Your mother would be proud." "Frank, there's something I want to propose to you." "What?" "You're always teaching me about gardening and how to be a better person. How about I teach you something in return?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "What could you teach me?" "Basic medicine. First aid. Things that could be useful in your work here at the hospital." "You'd do that?" "Of course. It would be my way of repaying everything you've taught me." Twice a week after their shifts, Robert began giving informal first aid lessons to Frank and other interested staff. He taught them about vital signs, how to recognize medical emergencies, and basic resuscitation techniques. Frank proved to be an exceptionally dedicated student, asking smart questions and absorbing information with the same intensity he had once devoted to learning to read years earlier. "You have a natural talent for this," Robert remarked after a particularly productive session. "Must be the teacher," Frank replied. "Mrs. Margaret always said a good teacher sparks the desire to learn." "Do you miss her?" Robert asked. "Every day, but I'm also grateful to have known her. And now, seeing you transform, I feel like part of her legacy lives on." 6 months after their first confrontation, Mercy General Hospital announced the creation of a special program, a therapeutic garden for recovering patients. The idea had come from a joint proposal by Robert and Frank. Robert had noticed how patients felt better when they could see plants and flowers from their windows. Frank had suggested creating a space where patients could actively participate in caring for the plants as part of their therapy. "It's unbelievable how this idea has evolved," Dr. Samuel remarked during the medical board meeting. "A therapeutic garden managed by our head gardener and our lead cardiovascular surgeon." "Frank isn't just our gardener," Robert corrected. "He's a specialist in therapeutic horticulture. He has knowledge none of us possess." The program was unanimously approved, and construction of the therapeutic garden began the following month. During the process, Robert and Frank worked side by side, planning every detail. They built raised beds for wheelchair-bound patients, chose plants safe for people with various medical conditions, and designated specific areas for different types of therapy. "You know," Frank said as they planned the aromatic plant section, "your mother would have loved this project." "Why?" "Because it combines two things she valued most: helping people and teaching. Patients won't just benefit from the plants, they'll learn about them." "Let's put up a plaque in her honor," Robert decided. "Something like Margaret Miller Therapeutic Garden, where care blooms." Frank smiled, clearly moved by the suggestion. She would have been honored. On the day of the garden's opening, a small crowd gathered at the hospital: patients, staff, and even some of Margaret's former students whom Frank had contacted. Robert gave a speech about the importance of holistic therapy in medical care. Frank explained how plants could aid the healing process. But the most emotional moment came when Dorothy, Frank's wife, read one of Margaret's letters about finding beauty even in the hardest times. "My mother always believed nature had healing powers," Robert told the audience. "This garden is our way of honoring that belief and her memory." After the ceremony, when most people had left, Robert and Frank remained in the garden. "We did it," Robert said, looking around at the space they had created together. "We did it," Frank agreed, "and this is just the beginning." "What do you mean?" "I mean this garden will touch lives for decades. Patients will heal here, staff will find peace here, families will make memories here." "And it all started with a simple question," Robert reflected. "What question?" "Why don't you ever visit your mother's grave?" Frank laughed. "Sometimes the simplest questions have the deepest answers." A year had passed since that first confrontation. Robert had become a completely transformed person. His relationship with the hospital staff was respectful and warm. His patients adored him, not just for his technical skill, but for his genuine compassion. He and Catherine had developed a solid friendship, built on mutual respect and the understanding that they had both grown since the divorce. Frank had become more than a co-worker. He had become Robert's best friend. They continued their weekly visits to the cemetery, now occasionally joined by Dorothy, who loved sharing more stories about Margaret. The therapeutic garden had become one of the hospital's most successful programs, with patients reporting significant physical and emotional improvements. But perhaps the most meaningful change was that Robert had started teaching medicine at public schools, inspiring underprivileged youth to consider careers in healthcare. "It's the circle closing," he explained to Frank after one of these classes. "My mother taught you, you taught me to be a better person, and now I'm teaching others." "And what have you learned from all this?" Frank asked. Robert thought carefully before answering. "I've learned that true success isn't about what you achieve. It's about what you give back. I've learned that humility isn't putting yourself down, it's recognizing the humanity in others. And most of all, I've learned it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Your mother always knew that, Frank said. She saw the man you could be, even when you were lost. And you helped me find that man. No, Robert. I just helped you remember he was always there. On a Sunday morning, 2 years after that initial confrontation, Robert was at the cemetery placing fresh flowers on his mother's grave when he noticed something different. There were other flowers there, not just the ones he and Frank regularly left. Flowers from different people, clearly placed at different times during the week. "Frank," Robert called as his friend arrived, "did you see these extra flowers?" Frank smiled. "I did. They started appearing a few months ago." "Who are they from?" "From your mother's former students. Word spread about how you changed, about the therapeutic garden, about everything you're doing. People wanted to start honoring her memory too." Robert felt a wave of emotion. "So my mother is being remembered by many people." "She is, and not just remembered. Her legacy is being carried on through you." As they tended to the grave together, Robert reflected on the journey he had taken. 2 years ago, he had been a bitter, lonely man, using professional success to mask emotional emptiness. Now, he was a man connected to his community, respected not just for his skill, but for his humanity. He had true friendships, a purpose beyond himself, and an inner peace he had spent his whole life searching for without realizing it. "Frank," Robert said as they finished their work, "can I ask you one last question?" "Of course." "Do you think my mother is at peace? That she knows how things have changed?" Frank stopped working and looked at Robert with that gentle smile that had become so familiar. "Robert, I believe the people we love never truly leave us. They live on through the choices we make, the people we become, and the love we spread in the world. Your mother is at peace because you've finally become the man she always knew you could be. And more than that, you're carrying on her work in ways she could never have imagined." Robert nodded, feeling a sense of wholeness he hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you, Frank, for everything. Thank you, Robert, for showing me that redemption is possible, that people can change, and that a mother's love can transform lives even after she's gone." As they walked out of the cemetery together, Robert glanced back one last time. His mother's grave was beautiful, surrounded by colorful flowers and tended with love by people whose lives she had touched. But more important than that, her legacy lived on in the son who had found his way back, in the garden that had bloomed at the hospital, and in the countless lives that would continue to be changed by the example of generosity and kindness she had planted in the world. End of story. Now tell me, do you believe people can truly change just as Robert did? Share your thoughts in the comments with heartfelt words. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other uplifting stories that could brighten your day.